Right. Okay. I wonder, have you ever heard somebody say something that just made you go, "What? What?" Like a kind of spit your tea out moment. Have you seen that meme where you just that person spits their drink out is brilliant. Maybe it was something somebody said that was just so funny, or maybe it was just outrageous that made you go, "What? You can't say that." Um, so because of my role, I get to go into schools and do different bits of work. And I was once in an lesson, so religious education lesson, okay, religious studies, and the head of RE said, "Well, Jesus never claimed that he was the Son of God." And I was standing there when she said that, and it was kind of like, what kind of moment, and I had to kind of politely disagree with her. And of course, the argument is that Jesus never said he was God's son. That this is just a story that Christians have kind of made up in retrospect to fit the narrative that they want. And I do actually understand why people say this, because Jesus never he didn't really say, "Well, I am the Son of God." He didn't sort of use that language. He used different language a lot of the time. He used phrases like, "I and the Father are one," and other sort of phrases as well, which made him out to be equal with God. And it was that was meant that he was accused of blasphemy, and blasphemy just means insulting something that is sacred. And so the Jews at the time felt like Jesus had insulted something sacred, that what he said was blasphemy by making out that he was equal with God. This was blasphemy, a crime punishable by death. And in fact, these verses that we're going to look at today, this happens when Jesus is being trialed at kind of what they called the Sanhedrin, which was like a little kind of court of law for the Jews. Okay, and even if you look at all the, I won't go into it now, but if you looked at all the kind of interesting bits to do with that trial, that little trial that they did, the Jews or the high priests and the religious people at the time, they broke a whole lot of laws in order to conduct what they did, that trial, because they were they weren't supposed to meet at night, and they met at night. um, they were supposed to meet in a specific building, which they didn't. The witnesses were supposed to be like examined separately, and they had to agree in great detail, and lots of these things just didn't happen. And so actually, and there's more to that as well, but actually what that means is that they were so eager to kind of pass the death sentence on Jesus, is that they broke a whole load of their own laws, which was something that they were really sort of dead against. They were a stickler for the laws at the time. So really, when sort of people say, oh, well, he never really said the Son of God. Well, you have to ask the question, well, why were they so keen to kill him? Because they didn't want to kill Jesus just because he was a nice bloke, just because he was kind to people. He obviously said something which really upset them. So, okay, you see, then you ask, well, why did Jesus never outrightly say, "Well, I'm the Son of God"? Why did he use sort of slightly different language? One of his favourite phrases is a phrase called, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. Okay, now I guess the Son of Man could be thought of as an ordinary phrase for human being, and he was a human, and he was born, of a human person. So there is an element of that to this, but it was also an Old Testament term that perhaps we sometimes don't always understand. It actually came from the book of Daniel. Daniel was a guy in the Old Testament, okay, and he had a vision. And in his vision, he describes someone that he uses the phrase "a son of man," and he talks about him as a really exalted figure, not just a human figure, but someone who's sort of almost heavenly. Okay, and so Jesus uses this phrase "son of man" in reference to what Daniel is referring to. And you could ask the question, well, why? Why did Jesus use that phrase? Because that's a little bit confusing, surely. But the reason that Jesus was quite subtle about it, because he didn't always want to openly reveal his identity, because actually the people of his day thought a Messiah was going to be someone who was going to be, basically, was going to take up arms and fight the Romans and fight the other people. And that wasn't what Jesus was about. Jesus actually was about sacrificing himself so he could be free of sin. Um, and so Jesus was sort of sometimes quite subtle about who he was because he didn't want people to push him into a role that he actually wasn't there for. So that's why, and this is really interesting. And the reason I'm sort of drawing attention to it is because I was looking at it the other day. It's in Mark chapter 4, and this is when he's being tried by the high priest, and the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" So this is an outright, direct question, and Jesus says, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And again, that's kind of like, oh, that's a kind of interesting way to say it. But first of all, he says, "I am." So he says, yeah, "Are you the Messiah?" "I am." And then he references this thing about Son of Man. And if you read Daniel 7, Daniel, in his vision, he says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence." So again, it's kind of like Jesus is directly referencing what Daniel is talking about. And the high priest then kind of like says he tore his clothes. So that's what they did when they were so outraged by something. They would tear their clothes. It says the high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him as worthy of death. And someone began to spit at him. They blindfolded him and struck him with their fists. So really, just to say that, oh, Christians retrospectively kind of added this to Jesus, but he never really said that he was the Messiah, well, actually, if you look at it, that claim really holds no grounds, because if Jesus didn't claim to be the Son of God, then there simply was no reason to kill him. And as when he was asked direct question, he said, "I am," and then gave another reference to something from the Old Testament. So it really was quite clear. Jesus did say he was God's Son. So the real question really is, what do I think and what do you think about the fact that Jesus thought he was God's Son, the Messiah?